fist came down on the door again. Harder this time. Desperate. Out in the screaming white, a man was begging to be let in. The same man who had stood at her husband's grave and told her she would never last the winter. And below the frozen ground, in the only warm place left in a buried world, a young widow stood with her hand frozen on the latch. She had every reason to leave it shut. Every cruel word, every cold look, every quiet betrayal in the dark, all of it pressed against her now, as heavy as the snow above. Then, beneath the howl of the storm, she heard it, a child, crying. And in that single breath, with the wind clawing at the door and the cold reaching for them all, she had to choose what kind of person grief had made her. The wind came down from the hills that morning, like something with a purpose. It pressed against the little church at the edge of the valley, rattling the old glass in its frames, slipping through the cracks in the door, curling around the ankles of everyone who had come to stand in the cold. But no one was looking at the windows. They were looking at her, a young woman, alone beside a pine coffin. Barely more than a girl, some of them thought, though grief had already begun its quiet work on her face, hollowing it, stilling it, turning 26 into something older and heavier than years could explain. She wore a black wool coat that had seen better winters. Snow gathered on her shoulders, and she did not brush it away. And pressed against her leg, so close it seemed they shared a single heartbeat, stood a dog, a shepherd mix, gray at the muzzle, ribs showing faintly beneath rough fur. He did not bark. He did not move. He only leaned into her, harder each time the wind rose, as though he understood, in the way animals sometimes seem to understand, that the whole shape of the world had just changed. The preacher spoke on. His words lifted into the air, and the air carried them away, thinning them, scattering them, until they were nothing but breath and frost. Most of the town was not really listening. They had come, yes, they had put on their darkest clothes and driven their wagons through the cold, but their eyes kept drifting back to the widow at the front, watching, measuring, waiting to see what would become of her. There is a particular cruelty in a small place, not loud, not sharp, just patient, the kind that lets a person stand alone in the wind and quietly decides in advance that she will not last the season. She knew they were watching. She could feel it on the back of her neck, that weight of 100 small judgments. But she did not turn. She did not weep where they could see. She only stood, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes fixed on the long box of pale wood that held the man she had loved. A shovel struck the frozen ground. The sound cracked across the cemetery like a branch breaking under snow. Another strike followed, then another. The earth did not want to open. It had hardened with the first hard freeze, and it fought every inch, giving up its ground grudgingly in dark frozen clods. She listened to each blow. She did not look away. The coffin lowered. The first shovelful fell, and the sound it made was a dull, final thing. A sound she would carry for a long time after. Then the second, then the third, and with each muffled fall of earth, it seemed the future fell with it. Everything they had planned, everything he had promised, everything she had let herself believe in the warmth of better days about the life the two of them would build. Gone now, layer by layer. beneath the cold. When at last the grave was full, the people came forward, one by one. They offered the small things people offer: a nod, a murmured word, a hand laid briefly on a shoulder and quickly withdrawn. None of them stayed. The cold was real and the day was short, and no one wanted to linger on that bare hill any longer than they had to. One by one, and the wagons creaked away down the white road. One by one, the dark figures grew small and disappeared, until only she was left. She and the dog, and the new grave, and the wind. Winter had come early that year. Everyone said so. The geese had gone south before their time. The cattle had grown their winter coats while the leaves were still on the trees. The old folks shook their heads and muttered that the land could feel something coming, even if the people could not. Everyone felt it. Everyone, that is, except the man who had not yet left. He came up the slope behind her, slow and deliberate, his boots crunching the frozen crust. She did not turn, but she knew the sound of him. She had known it for years. Garrett, her husband's older brother. He stopped beside the fresh-turned earth and stood there a moment, looking down at it, his hat in his hands, his breath rising white. And then he stepped closer, too close. His shadow stretched long across the snow, falling over her, falling over the grave. "You can't stay out here," he said. "Not alone. Not through a winter like this one's shaping up to be." His voice was gentle. That was the thing about Garrett. His voice was always gentle. But she had learned over the years to watch his eyes instead, and his eyes had never once matched the softness in his mouth. She said nothing. He turned slowly and looked out across the property, past the small cabin with its thin ribbon of chimney smoke, all the way to the far edge of the land, to the shed. It stood alone out there at the bottom of the field, an old thing, a leaning thing. Its roof sagged in the middle like a tired back, and its gray walls tilted slightly, as though the wind had been pushing on them for years and had nearly won. On a good day, it looked abandoned. Today, against the white and the gray and the low iron sky, it looked forgotten entirely. "I'll give you a fair price," Garrett said, "for all of it. The land, the cabin." He paused. "That old shed out there too, though it isn't worth the nails holding it together." He let that sit a moment. "Take the money. Go back east. You've got people there, don't you? Start fresh. Somewhere warm. Somewhere a woman alone doesn't have to break her back just to make it to spring." There it was. A woman alone. He said it kindly. He always said the cruel things kindly. But she heard underneath it the thing he truly meant. The thing the whole town meant, in their watching and their waiting. That she was not enough. That without the man in the ground, she was a problem to be solved. A burden to be moved. A girl who would surely fail. And the only question was how quickly, and who would buy the land when she did. She looked at the shed. The last place he had worked. The last place he had stood, hammer in hand, in the long gold evenings before the fever came. The last thing he had talked about, even near the end, when the words came hard and his eyes had gone bright and far away. She looked at it for a long time. And Garrett, watching her silence, did what people always did. He mistook it for weakness. He thought she was wavering. He thought the cold and the grief had hollowed her out, and that all that was left was a frightened young thing who would take his money and disappear and trouble no one ever again. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. "Think on it," he said at last, settling his hat back onto his head. "But don't think too long. Storms like the one that's coming, they don't wait for a person to make up her mind." He touched the brim of his hat to her, the way a man does to a woman he has already decided he understands. And then he walked back down the slope to his wagon and climbed up and drove away into the gathering gray. She stood by the grave until the cold had gone all the way through her. Then she walked home. The dog walked with her, close at her side, his paws breaking small prints into the snow beside her own. The cabin felt different now. Not empty, exactly. Worse than empty, it was full of him. Full of all the small things that had not yet learned he was gone. The chair he had built sat by the stove, just where he always left it, turned slightly toward the window so he could watch the weather while he whittled. His coat still hung by the door, the shape of his shoulders still in it. A mug sat on the shelf where he had set it down. One ordinary morning, in an ordinary moment, with no idea it would be the last time his hand would hold it. Nothing had moved. And because nothing had moved, the whole place seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a step on the porch that would not come. She did not light all the lamps that first night. She sat in the dark with the dog's head heavy in her lap, and she let the silence have her. There is a kind of quiet that settles into a house after a death. It is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything the person will never do again. The door he will never open. The fire he will never bank. The low murmur of his voice in the next room, saying her name the way no one else in the world had ever said it. She did not cry. Not because she was strong. She did not feel strong. She simply could not find the bottom of it. And a person cannot weep for a thing that has no bottom. So she sat. And the night went on. And the dog stayed close. The days that followed ran together like water under ice. She moved through them out of habit more than will. She fed the dog. She fed the small fire. She broke the skin of frost off the water bucket each morning and made herself eat something, though everything tasted of nothing. The dog never left her. He followed her from room to room, never more than a few steps behind, and at night he lay across the foot of the bed where the cold came in, as if he had appointed himself the keeper of the one warm thing left in the house. She was grateful for him in a way she could not have spoken aloud, because a person can go a long time without words, but no one can survive long without something to be needed by. It was on one of those gray, sunken evenings, with the light failing early and the wind testing the shutters, that she found herself by the window again, and her eyes drifted, the way they kept drifting, out across the white field, to the shed, and something stirred, not grief this time, a memory. It rose up whole and warm, so vivid it nearly stopped her breath, so far from the cold of the present that for a moment she could almost feel the summer on her skin. A night, months and seasons ago. The air thick and soft, crickets singing in the tall grass beyond the cabin. A full moon hung low and yellow over the hills, pouring its light across the field, turning the old shed silver. And there he was, Elias, standing just outside the shed's open door, a lantern at his feet, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hands rough with the day's work. And his face had that look on it, the one she had fallen in love with, the one that came over him whenever an idea took hold of him and would not let go. Not the look of a man chasing money. He had never once in his life cared much for money, which was, depending on who you asked in that town, either his finest quality or his greatest failing. No, it was the look of a man chasing an idea. She had walked out to him through the warm grass, the dog trotting ahead, and she had teased him gently for staying out so late, for the sawdust in his hair, for the drawings she'd found scattered across the table that she could make no sense of. And he had laughed. And then he had grown quiet and pointed off across the dark land, out past the lantern light. "Everybody keeps building higher," he had said. "Bigger barns, taller houses, thicker walls." He shook his head slowly. Maybe that's the mistake. Maybe that's been the mistake all along. She had asked him what he meant, and he had crouched down and run his hand through the cool dirt of the shed floor and looked up at her with the moonlight in his eyes. "The safest place in a hard winter," he said, "isn't above the ground." He let the dirt fall through his fingers. "It's under it." She had laughed then, not unkindly. She had never been unkind to him, but it had sounded like one of his dreams, one of his beautiful, impossible notions that he turned over and over in the long evenings. The kind of thing that was lovely to listen to, and would surely never come to anything. He had only smiled at her laughter. He was used to it. The whole town laughed at Elias. They called him a dreamer when they were being kind, and worse when they were not. But he had kept that smile, soft and certain, like a man who knew something the rest of them didn't. And then he had taken her hand, dirt and all, and they had walked back to the cabin under the enormous moon, and she had not thought of it again. Not really, until now. She sat very still by the window as the memory faded, the cold creeping back in around the edges of it, and something he had said, something she had nearly forgotten, surfaced slowly in her mind, the way a stone rises out of melting snow. A key. He had hidden a key, not to the cabin, not to any lock she knew. She remembered asking him about it, once, half teasing. And she remembered the way he had only smiled and changed the subject, the way he did when a thing mattered to him too much to make light of. "You'll know when it's time," was all he had ever said. Her heart, which had been so slow and heavy for days, gave a sudden uneven beat. Then another. She stood up. The dog rose at once, ears lifting, watching her with those steady dark eyes. She crossed the room. She didn't fully know what she was doing yet, or why. Only that something in her had woken for the first time since the wind had carried the preacher's words away over the cold hill. She remembered something else now. Months back, she had seen him do it. She had come in from the cold and caught him reaching up into a narrow gap in the stone, high above the fireplace, where the chimney met the wall. She had thought nothing of it at the time. A man has his small habits. She had not asked. She dragged the wooden stool across the floor. She set it by the stone chimney, still faintly warm from the day's small fire, and she climbed up onto it. And she reached into the dark. Her fingers met cold stone first, then old soot, soft and dry, then the dusty drift of a spider's long abandoned work, brushing against her skin like something trying to warn her back. She reached deeper. The dog watched from below, perfectly still, his head tilted, as though he too were waiting to see what her hand would find in the dark. And then, metal, cold, heavy, real. Her breath caught. Slowly, carefully, as if it might dissolve the moment she believed in it, she drew her hand back out of the stone, and there it lay, in her open palm, a key. Old iron, wrapped in a fine red skin of rust, heavy for its size, its teeth strange and uneven, clearly cut for no ordinary lock. She turned it over in the lamplight. It was warm now, where her hand had held it, as if it had only been waiting all this time in the cold dark of the wall, waiting for the right hand on the right night. Outside, the last gray light drained from the hills. The wind shifted, low and long, and somewhere out across the field, the old shed creaked on its tired bones. She looked toward the window. The dog had already turned to it. He stood there in the dimness, his gaze fixed on the dark shape of the shed at the far edge of the land. His tail very slowly beginning to move, side to side, as though he had finally understood where they were both meant to go. She closed her fingers around the key, and for the first time since the funeral, for the first time since the shovel had struck the frozen ground, and the whole future seemed to fall away beneath the falling earth. Something rose in her chest that was not grief. It was small. It was uncertain. But it was there. Not quite hope. Not yet. Something closer to a question. A door she did not yet have the courage to open, but could no longer pretend not to see. She thought of Garrett's gentle, certain voice. A woman alone. She thought of the whole town, watching from their wagons, waiting for her to fail. And she thought of Elias, crouched in the moonlight with the dirt running through his fingers, smiling that quiet smile of a man who knew something the others didn't. The safest place isn't above the ground. It's under it. She did not sleep much that night. She set the key on the table beside the bed, and every time she closed her eyes, she found them open again a moment later, drawn back to the dull red gleam of it in the low light. What had he built out there? What had he meant her to find? And why? Why had he hidden it, and smiled, and never told her, as if he had known, somehow, that he might not live long enough to show her himself? The questions turned in the dark. The wind walked the roof of the cabin, and far off, beyond the black line of the distant hills, where no one in the sleeping valley could yet see it, something was beginning to gather. A weight in the sky. A change in the deep, cold air. A wall of cloud, slow and vast and patient, that had not yet begun to move toward the valley, but soon would. She did not know that yet. All she knew, lying awake in the cold with the dog breathing softly at her feet and the iron key gleaming on the table beside her, was that the wavering thing inside her had finally hardened into something with a shape, a decision. When the first gray light came, when the long night finally loosened its grip and the window filled slowly with the pale promise of a sunless dawn. She rose. She did not light the lamps. She did not wait for the cold to lift, because it would not lift. She pulled on her coat, the same black wool that still carried the cemetery's snow in its memory. She wrapped a scarf around her throat. She took the key from the table and closed it tight in her fist, where she could feel its cold edges biting into her palm. A small, real, certain pain in a world that had gone soft and gray with loss. The dog was already at the door before she reached it. He looked back at her once, and then he looked at the door and waited. Every line of him pointed toward the field and the shed and whatever lay beyond it. She drew a breath. She thought of him standing in the moonlight. She thought of his voice and his smile and the idea he had carried alone for so long while the whole town laughed. "You'll know when it's time." "All right," she said softly. Her own voice startled her. Rough and quiet in the still room, the first words she had spoken aloud in days. "All right, Elias." She lifted the latch, and she stepped out into the bitter morning, the dog bounding ahead of her through the thin new snow toward the old leaning shed at the far edge of the world, where the last secret of the man she loved had been waiting all this time in the dark beneath the ground, for the day his widow would finally come to turn the key. The shed door had not been opened in a long time. The lock hung crooked from its hasp, swollen with rust, half-eaten by seasons of rain and frost. She stood before it with the key in her hand and the dog at her side, and for a moment she did not move at all. The wind pushed at her back, as if urging her on. Then she lifted the key and slid it into the lock. For a breath, nothing happened. The key would not turn. The cold had seized the works, and the rust had grown into the mechanism like roots into stone. And she thought, for one sinking moment, that this too would fail her. That even this last small thing he had left her would refuse to open. She pressed harder. She leaned her whole weight into it, her breath fogging the air, her cracked hands aching around the cold iron. And then, with a low and grinding reluctance, something gave. Metal scraped against metal deep inside the lock. A click. Sharp and clear, it rang out across the still white field like a sound from another world. The latch fell free. She stood there, her heart going hard, and she put her hand flat against the gray, weathered wood of the door and pushed. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed for oil. A breath of old air rolled out to meet her. Dry wood, cold dust, the faint, sweet smell of earth that has been kept too long from the sun. Light fell in past her shoulder, pale and thin, spilling across the dirt floor, and she looked inside, and her heart sank, because there was nothing there. Broken tools leaned against the walls, their handles gray and split. Coils of old rope hung from rusted nails. Stacks of scrap lumber, warped and gray, were piled in the corners beneath a fine, soft skin of dust. It was a shed. Just a shed. Just the leaning, forgotten thing the whole town believed it to be. The thing Garrett had called worthless, worth less than the nails that held it together. She stood in the doorway, the key still warm in her hand, and she felt the small flame that had carried her out across the frozen field begin, quietly, to gutter. Maybe Garrett had been right. Maybe grief had carried her out here on a foolish errand. Maybe the key opened nothing but an old man's clutter, and the memory of the moonlight and the dirt running through his fingers was only that. A memory, soft and golden, and meaning nothing at all. She let out a slow breath. And in that moment, when the disappointment had nearly closed over her completely, the dog barked. Once, sharp, sudden. She startled. The dog had moved past her into the middle of the shed, and he stood now over a spot in the dirt floor, his whole body gone rigid, his ears pricked forward. He barked again, and then he began to dig. His front paws tore at the packed earth, fast and frantic, throwing dirt back between his hind legs in dark sprays. "Scout," she said. "Scout, stop." He did not stop. He dug as though something beneath the floor were calling to him, as though he could smell it through the years and the cold, his claws scrabbling deeper and deeper into the hard-packed ground. And then his paw struck something. She heard it. A sound that was not the soft give of dirt. A solid, hollow sound. Thunk. She went very still. That was not stone. Stone does not sound like that. Stone is dead and final under a striking blow. This sound had a hollowness behind it, a space, a sound like knuckles rapping on a closed door. It was wood. She crossed the shed in 3 quick steps and dropped to her knees beside the dog. She seized an old shovel from where it leaned against the wall, and she began to dig too, throwing the loose earth aside, her tiredness forgotten, her breath coming fast and white in the cold. The dog dug beside her, and within minutes, the shape of it began to appear beneath the dirt. Straight edges, square corners, a surface of fitted planks, dark with age, set flush into the floor of the shed. A hatch, a wooden hatch, hidden beneath the dirt. In the floor of a shed the whole world believed was empty. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She brushed the last of the soil away with her bare hands, ignoring the cold, ignoring the splinters. And there, set into the center of the planks, she found it. A heavy iron ring. She stared at it. "What did you build out here?" she thought. "What did you do all those long evenings while they laughed at you and called you a dreamer?" She gripped the ring with both hands, and she pulled. The hatch did not move. Years of packed earth had sealed it shut, and the cold had frozen what the years had not. She braced her boots against the floor and pulled harder, the muscles of her back and shoulders burning, her teeth set, a low sound forcing itself out of her throat. And all at once, with a great tearing groan, the hatch broke free. It swung up and back and fell open against the dirt with a heavy crash, and cold air rushed up out of the dark. Not winter air, something else, deeper, older, still, the air that lives far down in the earth, where the seasons do not reach, where it is neither the heat of summer nor the bite of winter, but something else entirely. Something patient, something that has been waiting a very long time. She knelt there at the edge of it, breathing hard, and looked down. A narrow wooden staircase descended into blackness. She could see the first few steps, pale in the thin light from the doorway, and then the dark swallowed them whole. For a long moment she did not move. She simply stared down into that darkness, into the cold breath rising out of the earth, and she felt the whole weight of it pressing on her. Everything he had hidden, everything he had carried alone, everything he had never lived long enough to show her. And then the dog stepped past her. Without a moment's hesitation, without the slightest fear, he padded down into the dark and was gone. "Scout," she called. His bark floated back up to her from below, not frightened, not warning, steady, safe, waiting. She rose and crossed to the wall and found there an old oil lantern hanging from a nail, just where a careful man would have left it. Her hands shook as she lit the wick. The flame caught, steadied, and threw its small, warm circle of gold against the dark. And with the lantern held out before her, she stepped down into the earth. Each wooden step creaked beneath her boots. The light from the shed above grew smaller behind her. The cold of the winter fell away, step by step, replaced by that deeper, stranger stillness. The wind could not reach her here. She could no longer hear it. There was only the soft hiss of the lantern flame, and the sound of her own breath, and the gentle creak of the stairs carrying her down and down into the dark beneath the field. And then her boot touched flat ground. She stopped. She raised the lantern, and the light spread out before her. And her breath went out of her all at once, because Elias had not been dreaming. He had been building. The lantern light moved across stone walls, real walls, laid course by course with a careful hand, fitted and packed and squared. It moved across shelves carved directly into the earth, lined and braced with timber. It moved up to where slender pipes rose from the chamber and disappeared toward the surface far above, cut and placed to carry fresh air down into the deep. In one corner stood a small iron stove, half finished, its pipe reaching up toward a vent in the earthen ceiling. Along the walls were stacked tools, lumber, sacks and crates, coils of wire, things saved and gathered and carried out here, season after season, by a man who told no one, who endured the laughter of the whole town, who came home with dirt on his hands and a quiet smile and never once explained. And there, on a rough table at the center of it all, weighted down with stones against the cold draft from the stairs, were the plans, dozens of them, rolled and stacked and tied, page upon page, drawn in a steady, careful hand she knew as well as her own. She set the lantern on the table, and the tears came. Not the tears she had been unable to find at the graveside, not the bottomless grief that had no floor. These were different. These came from somewhere else entirely. From the unbearable tenderness of seeing, laid out before her in stone and timber and ink, the proof of how completely he had believed. He had believed in this. While they laughed, he had believed. While they called him a fool, he had come out here in the long evenings and laid stone upon stone, alone in the dark, building a thing he was not even sure he would ever need. Building it for her. Building it for the winter he felt coming the way the old folks felt it, in his bones, before anyone else would listen. She sank down onto the rough stool beside the table, and with trembling hands, she reached out and untied the first roll of plans and spread it open in the lantern light. The drawings covered every inch, measurements, angles, the careful geometry of the stone walls, diagrams of the ventilation, arrows showing how the cold air would sink and the warm air rise, how the earth itself would hold the heat of the small stove through the longest, hardest nights. Notes in the margins, in his cramped, familiar hand. Plans for food, plans for water, plans for light and warmth and air, all of it thought through, all of it reasoned out, season after patient season. And at the bottom of one page, set apart from the rest, written slowly, the pen pressed deep into the paper, a single line. She read it once, then she read it again. If winter ever comes harder than we fear, this will keep us alive. She sat very still in the gold light, deep in the silent earth, and looked at those words for a long, long time. Above her, far away, muffled by the layers of stone and soil, a gust of wind rattled the old shed. The sound filtered faintly down to her, thin and weak and harmless. Up there, The wind was a force that could knock a person down. Down here, it was nothing. A whisper, a rumor of a storm that could not touch her. And in that moment, deep beneath the frozen field, something changed in her that would not change back. It was not hope. Hope was too soft a word for it, too uncertain. It was something stronger. It was direction. For days she had been drifting, hollow, moved only by habit and the patient devotion of a dog who would not leave her. And now, all at once, she knew exactly what she had to do. She would finish it, whatever it took, however hard, however long. She would finish what he had started. She stayed down there until the lantern began to gutter. She read the plans by its failing light, tracing his lines with her finger, learning the shape of his thinking, the logic of the thing he had carried alone for so long. And when at last she climbed back up the creaking stairs and out into the cold, the day had changed. The light had gone gray and low. The sky had thickened. Clouds had drawn down over the hills, heavy and dark and full. The kind of clouds that made the older people in the valley go quiet and glance toward their woodpiles. She stood in the doorway of the shed and looked out across the white land. Far off, thin trails of smoke rose from the chimneys of the town. People were getting ready. She knew they were, bringing in wood, salting meat, banking their fires against the cold to come. But they were getting ready the way they always had. Wooden walls, wooden roofs, everything raised up high and proud against the sky. And everything, she understood now, with a sudden cold certainty, exposed. She looked back once at the dark mouth of the hatch behind her, at the stone and the timber and the quiet, patient strength of the thing waiting beneath the earth. Garrett thought she would sell. The town thought she would break. Neither of them understood what had just happened in the dark below their feet. She tightened her grip on the rolled plan she had carried up with her, and she set her face toward the coming cold. Tomorrow, she would begin. The work was harder than she had ever imagined work could be. She learned that on the very first day. The plans were clear, his thinking sound, but a plan on paper and a wall of stone in the freezing earth are two very different things, and her body had not been made for this, and it had to learn. It learned the slow way, the painful way. She hauled stone until her arms shook and her hands would no longer close. She mixed and packed and braced. She carried timber down the narrow stairs one piece at a time, her shoulders burning, her breath ragged in the cold, dark air below. She dug until the blisters on her palms broke open, and then she wrapped her hands in rags and dug some more. The dog stayed with her always. He took up his place at the top of the stairs, framed in the square of pale light from the shed door, and he kept his watch over the empty fields while she labored in the earth below. Sometimes, when her back was breaking and her spirit was thin, she would glance up and see him there, still, faithful, watching the white horizon, and somehow it was enough to make her lift the next stone. Her hands changed. The soft skin split and bled, and then it hardened, and then it grew rough and strong in a way her hands had never been. Her shoulders, which had ached so badly those first nights that she could not lift her arms to take off her own coat, grew steady and sure. She was becoming something the town would not have recognized. She was becoming someone who could do this. But the earth did not give its strength up easily. And one afternoon, deep in the chamber, with the lantern burning low, and the cold settled hard into the stone around her, The earth fought back. She was working at the far wall, setting a course of heavy stone into a section he had left unfinished. She had braced it the way the plan showed. She had been careful. She had been so careful. But the ground above that section had taken on too much weight. A wall of earth and old timber that had stood untouched for seasons, that she had disturbed with her digging without fully understanding. And as she fitted the last stone into place, it began to give. She heard it first. A low groan, deep in the wall, a sound like the earth itself drawing breath. Then a hiss of trickling soil. She looked up, and the wall above her shifted. There was no time to think. There was only the cold flash of pure animal knowing that ran through her body, the knowing that comes before thought, faster than fear. And she threw herself backward. The wall came down. Stone and frozen earth and old timber crashed into the space where she had been kneeling a half-second before. A roar of falling weight that filled the chamber, that put out the lantern in a gust of disturbed air, that left her sprawled in sudden, total darkness, with the thunder of it still echoing off the stone. And then, silence. A terrible, ringing silence. She lay on her back in the dark, her heart slamming, dust thick in her throat, unable for a moment even to tell if she was hurt. Above her, somewhere in the blackness, she heard the dog, barking, frantic, wild, his claws scrabbling at the top of the stairs, his voice cracking with a fear she had never heard in him before. She started, and the dust seized her, and she coughed and could not speak. She pushed herself up. Her hands found her legs, her arms, her ribs, bruised, scraped, whole. A foot to the left, and the earth would have buried her there in the dark. A foot to the left, and the town would have had its ending after all. The foolish widow, lost beneath the very ground she had been mad enough to dig. She sat in the blackness, shaking, the dog's frantic barking the only sound, and for one long moment, the whole weight of it pressed down on her. The cold, the dark, the danger, the impossible size of what she had taken on alone. She could have wept. She could have climbed those stairs and sealed the hatch and walked back to the cabin and let it all go. No one would have blamed her. No one would even have been surprised. But she sat there in the dark, and slowly, as her breath steadied, as the dust settled, a different feeling rose in her. Not despair, something harder, because he had not finished it. That was why the wall had failed. Not because the idea was wrong, but because it was unfinished, because the man who built it had run out of time, had been taken before he could brace that last week span, and if she gave up now, then everything he had endured, every season of laughter, every night alone in the cold, dark earth, every stone he had laid with his own 2 hands, all of it would come to nothing. She would not let it come to nothing. She found the lantern in the dark by feel. Her fingers, raw and bleeding now, closed around the cold metal of it, and she fumbled with the matches, and on the 3rd try, the flame caught and held, and the small gold light pushed back the dark. She looked at the fallen wall, the wreck of her work. The stones scattered, the timber splintered, the dark wound of earth gaping where the chamber had nearly become her grave. And she did not see ruin. She saw the place where he had run out of time. She saw the work that was left for her to do. "All right," she whispered into the dark, the way she had whispered it that first cold morning. Her voice was rough and small in the buried silence. "All right, I see it now. I'll brace it deeper." Above her, the dog had gone quiet, as if he had heard her, as if he understood that she was whole, and that she was not, after all, going to stop. She climbed the stairs to him, and when she reached the top, he pressed himself against her so hard he nearly knocked her down, his whole body trembling, and she knelt there in the doorway of the shed and held him, dust and blood and all, and let him press his rough head into her neck. "I'm here," she told him. "I'm still here." The days that followed were the hardest of all, because it was not only the work now, it was the running out. The lamp oil grew low. She learned to work in dimness, to spare the flame, to do as much as she could by the thin gray light that fell down the stairs in the daytime hours. The food in the cabin dwindled. She ate less and worked more, and felt the cold settle into her in a way that food was meant to keep out. There was a night. She would remember it for a long time after. A night when she sat alone at the cabin table, her hands wrapped in rags, every muscle in her body crying out, the wind moaning at the shutters, a single candle burning down between her and the dark. And the thought came. The thought she had held off for so long. What if Garrett is right? What if it cannot be done? Not by one person, not by her. What if she was only a foolish, grieving girl who had mistaken a dead man's dream for a thing the living could finish? And what if the only thing waiting for her at the end of all this labor was the same cold ending the whole town had already written for her? She sat with that thought a long time. The candle burned lower, and the dog, who had been lying by the door, rose and crossed the room, and laid his heavy head in her lap, and looked up at her with those steady dark eyes, the eyes that had watched over her every single day since the wind carried the preacher's words away over the cold hill. And she remembered the line at the bottom of the page. "If winter ever comes harder than we fear, this will keep us alive." Us. He had written us. He had not built that place for himself. He had built it for the two of them. For a future he had imagined so completely that he had carved it into stone, against a winter he had felt coming long before anyone would believe him. She could not finish it for herself alone, but she could finish it for the U.S. he had believed in. She put her hand on the dog's head. "Not tonight," she said softly. "We don't quit tonight." And in the morning, she went back out to the shed, and she went down into the earth, and she lifted the next stone. She did not have a choice about going to the town. The food was nearly gone, and a body that labors cannot run on nothing. And so, one cold morning, she hitched the wagon and drove the white road into the heart of the little valley. The general store was warm and close, full of the smell of coffee and oiled wood and wood smoke. And the moment she stepped through the door, the talking stopped. It was not a loud thing. It was worse than loud. It was the sudden small hush of a room full of people who had been speaking of someone, and who now had that someone standing among them. Eyes turned toward her, then away, then back again. She knew what they saw. The widow. The girl from the homestead at the edge of the valley. The one whose hands were wrapped in rags now, whose face had gone thin and weathered, who, the whole town knew, had taken to digging like a madwoman in the frozen earth beneath an old shed. They had their theories. She could feel them, hanging in the warm, close air. Grief had taken her mind, some said. Loss did that to the soft ones. It was a shame. It was only to be expected. She gathered her supplies in silence. She did not explain herself. There was no explaining the things she had seen in the earth, the things she carried now beneath her ribs like a coal. And when she carried her sacks back out into the cold, he was waiting for her. Garrett. He stood beside her wagon, his collar turned up against the wind, and he watched her load her supplies with that gentle, patient expression that never reached his eyes. "Folks are worried about you," he said. She kept loading the wagon, out there alone, digging in the dirt like, well, he let it hang. It isn't right. It isn't safe. A young woman, no man to look after her, wearing herself down to nothing, chasing... What? What is it you're chasing out there? She did not answer, and something flickered behind his gentle eyes. Something tight, something pressed down, something that had been there a long time. Because Garrett had not slept easy. Not for a long while. He had debts. The kind a man does not speak of. The kind that follow him into church and sit beside him at his own table and whisper to him in the dark. That land at the edge of the valley would have settled them. He had been so sure of it. So sure the grieving girl would crumble and sell and slip away east, and that the homestead would fall to him, the older brother, the steady one, the one who had always known better than his fool of a younger sibling with his dirt and his dreams. He had counted on it. And there was something else too. Something older and meaner that he would never say aloud, even to himself, because his brother, his quiet, dreaming, laughed-at brother, had been loved. Loved by this woman with a fierceness that Garrett, in all his steady, respectable years, had never once seen turned toward himself. Even his own wife looked at him with a kind of careful patience, never that. And to watch the dreamer's widow refuse to break, to watch her grow stronger out there in the cold instead of weaker, it scratched at something in him he did not like to look at. "You'll bury yourself," he said, and his gentle voice had an edge to it now, thin and cold. "Before the winter ever gets the chance." She climbed up onto the wagon seat. She took up the reins, and she looked down at him, and for the first time she answered. "No," she said. One word, quiet, steady, final. Then she snapped the reins, and the wagon rolled away down the white road, and left him standing there in the cold, his jaw tight, his eyes following her until she was small in the distance. What she did not see, in the days that followed, what she could not have seen, was the figure that came to the edge of her land in the gray hour before dawn. Garrett, telling himself it was for her own good, telling himself a man had to protect his family, his name, the debts that gnawed at him in the dark. She would find in the mornings small wrongnesses she could not explain. A brace knocked loose that she was sure she had set firm. A sack of carefully saved supplies spilled and ruined in the snow. Tracks, half filled with new fallen white, leading away from the shed toward the road. She told herself it was the wind, the cold, her own exhaustion playing tricks. But somewhere underneath, she began to understand that she was not only fighting the earth and the cold and the dwindling of her own strength. She was fighting a man who wanted her to fail. And still, she did not stop. She braced the loose braces tighter. She moved her supplies down into the chamber, deep in the earth, where no hand in the dark could reach them. She set the dog to watch the road, and stone by stone, day by day, the thing beneath the field grew stronger, grew closer to the shape he had drawn, grew toward the moment, fast approaching now, when it would have to be everything he had promised, or nothing at all. Because the sky had begun to change. She noticed it on a morning that should not have been so cold. Snow had begun to fall, softly, sparsely, at a time of year when the air should still have held a memory of warmth. It came down wrong, out of season, dusting the bare ground with white that did not belong. She stood in the doorway of the shed and watched it fall, and a chill walked up the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked toward the far hills, and there, low along the horizon, where the gray sky met the gray land, something was gathering. A wall, a long dark wall of cloud, vast and heavy and slow, stretched across the whole northern edge of the world. It did not race. It did not rush. It only stood there, deepening, building, the way a thing builds when it is in no hurry at all, the way a thing builds when it knows it has all the time it needs, and nowhere it can be stopped. She watched it for a long time. The dog came and stood beside her, and he watched it too, and a low sound rose in his throat that she had never heard him make. She thought of the smoke rising from the chimneys of the town, of the wooden walls, the wooden roofs, everything raised high and proud against the sky, everything exposed, and she thought of the line at the bottom of the page, written slow and deep, by a man who had felt this coming long before anyone would listen. If winter ever comes harder than we fear. She turned and she went back down into the earth. There was so little time left now. And far across the distant hills, the dark wall waited and began, at last, to move. It began, strangely, with silence. Not the loud arrival a person might expect of a great storm. Quiet. The birds went first. For days, the bare trees at the edge of the field had been full of small, restless sounds. The chatter and flutter of little wings, the scrape of claws on frozen branches. And then, on a single gray morning, all of it stopped. She noticed it the way a person notices an absence rather than a presence. She stepped out of the cabin with the water bucket, and something was wrong. And it took her a long moment standing in the cold to understand what it was. The birds were gone. All of them. As if they had been given some warning the people of the valley could not hear, and had heeded it without question, and fled south in the night while the rest of the world slept on. Then the smaller creatures vanished too. No tracks crossed the white field in the mornings now. No rabbit broke from the frozen brush when the dog ran the fence line. The hawks that had circled the far hills were gone from the sky. The land was emptying itself, quietly, steadily, of everything that could run or fly, until only the woman and the dog remained out at the edge of the valley, beneath that low and waiting sky. And then even the wind died. That was the worst of it. The stillness. A great and total stillness settled over the whole valley. The kind that presses on the ears. The kind that makes a person stop in the middle of a task and lift her head and listen to a silence so deep it seems to hum against the skin. The smoke from the cabin chimney rose straight up now, in a thin, unwavering line, because there was not a breath of air to bend it. The valley felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting. She felt it too. She stood in the doorway of the shed in that terrible quiet, the dog rigid at her side, and she looked out at the dark wall on the horizon, the wall of cloud that had grown day after day until it filled half the sky and turned the afternoon to dusk. And she knew, whatever was coming, it was close now. So she worked through that last still day without stopping once. She carried the final load of stone down the narrow stairs, one heavy piece at a time, her breath loud in the buried quiet. She braced the last weak span, the one that had nearly buried her alive, deeper and stronger than the plans had even called for. She had learned the cost of his unfinished work in bruises and broken skin, and the cold memory of darkness closing over her. She would not be careless with it now. She checked the slender pipes that carried the air down from above, clearing the snow from their mouths in the field with her bare hands. She checked the small iron stove, and the seal of the hatch, and the stores she had carried down day by day and stacked along the carved shelves. And she read his notes one last time by the failing gray light, not because she needed to. She knew them now by heart, the way a person knows a prayer. She read them because his hand was on the paper, and on a day like this one, with the dark wall pressing down over the world, she wanted to feel him near. Then the short day failed, and the dark came down, and it broke. The stillness shattered all at once. The wind returned, but not as it had left. It came back changed, vast and screaming, a moving wall of air that struck the valley like a thing with a will of its own. It hit the cabin, and the cabin shuddered to its foundations. It found the bare trees and bent them double. It came howling down off the dark hills and across the open field, and behind it came the snow, not falling, driving. It came sideways across the land, so fast and so thick that the world dissolved into white, hurled against the cabin walls with a sound like thrown sand, like 1,000 small fists beating at the wood, beating to be let in. She woke before dawn that first night to the cabin trembling around her. The walls flexed and shuddered. The roof groaned overhead, a low sound of strain that ran through the beams. The wind found every crack and every seam and screamed through them, high and thin and endless, and the cold came in behind it, a cold that no fire could push back, a cold that slid under the blankets and reached for the very marrow of her bones. The dog was already on his feet by the door. His ears were flat against his skull. His body was low and tense. A deep sound rolled in his chest, and his eyes, when they found hers across the dark room, held something she had never seen in them before. This storm was different. He knew it in his bones, the way the animals had known to flee. She knew it too. By the gray ghost of midday, she could no longer see past the porch rail. The world had narrowed to a few feet of swirling white, and beyond that, nothing. No field, no fence, no sky. The shed, out at the far edge of her land, had vanished completely, swallowed whole, as though it had never stood there at all. She went out once, only once. She set her shoulder to the door and shoved it open against the press of the wind, and the storm nearly took her off her feet the moment she stepped through. This cold did not bite. It seized. It closed over her like cold water, stealing her breath. and the snow tore past her so fast and so hard that it stung the skin like flung grit. Within 3 steps, she could no longer see the door she had come out of. Within 3 steps, she was lost, in her own yard, a stone's throw from her own hearth. A spike of pure animal fear went through her, and she turned and felt her way back along the wall with her hands until the door frame found her fingers, and she half fell back inside. She stood with her back against the door, chest heaving, her face raw and burning. The dog pressed so hard against her legs, she could feel his heart going. And she understood, fully and finally, the thing she had to do. The cabin would not survive this. She could feel it in the way the walls flexed beneath her shoulder. The wooden walls. The wooden roof, everything raised high and proud against a sky that had now turned its full and terrible fury upon it. The cabin was built the way the whole valley was built, the way that had always been enough, in all the gentler winters that had come before. But this was not the winters that had come before. The shelter would survive. The stone, the earth, the deep, patient stillness beneath the field, where the wind could not reach, and the cold could not follow. She made her decision in the dark of that long, shuddering day, and before the next dawn could break, she began to move. What followed was a battle she would carry in her body for the rest of her days. In the still hour before the worst of it, she had done one wise thing. She had strung a rope from the cabin door across the field all the way to the shed. A single line of hemp she could follow blind through any depth of white. She did not know, when she strung it, how much her life would come to depend on it. Now she loaded her arms with what she could carry. Food first, then blankets, then water, and lamp oil, and the few tools she could not do without. She opened the cabin door, and she walked out into the storm. She could not see the shed. She could not see 10 feet. She walked toward where she knew it had to be. Head down, one frozen hand closed hard around the rope, the wind shoving at her like a living thing, like hands trying to push her down into the snow and hold her there. The cold stripped the warmth from her with every step. The rope was her whole world. The rope and the dark shape of the dog at her heels, and the next step, and the next, and the next. She reached the shed. She fought the door open against the drift. She fell inside, out of the wind, into a sudden roaring quiet, and her breath came in great, ragged gasps. She lowered her load down into the dark mouth of the hatch, and then she turned and went back out into the white for more. Again, the cabin, the rope, the shed, the hatch, and again. Her hands went past cold, past pain, into a thick and frightening numbness. Her face lost its feeling. The wind found the gaps in her coat and reached inside and squeezed the warmth out of her like water from a rag. Trip after trip after trip, her strength burning down to nothing. And then somehow burning lower still, finding some last reserve she had not known was there. Some deep, stubborn ember that refused, simply refused to go out. She lost count of how many times she crossed that frozen distance. There was a moment, somewhere in the middle of it, when she stumbled and went down to her knees in the snow, and the wind howled over her, and the cold whispered to her that she could simply stay there, rest, just for a moment, Just close her eyes. And the dog's cold nose pressed hard against her cheek. He barked once, sharp in her ear, and shoved his head beneath her arm and would not let her be still. She got up. Because of him, she got up. And she went on. She only knew that at last she stood inside the shed with the final load in her arms, with everything that mattered carried down into the earth, and that there was nothing left in the cabin worth dying for. She called the dog to her. "Down," she said, and her voice was a cracked and frozen thing. "Go on now. Down." And he went, padding down the creaking stairs into the warm dark below. And she followed him, and she reached up over her head with her last strength, and she pulled the hatch closed, and she sealed it, and the storm disappeared. The change was so sudden, so complete, that for a long moment she simply stood at the bottom of the stairs and could not move at all. Above her, on the other side of the earth, the storm still raged. She knew it did. It was tearing at the valley, burying the world, screaming its fury at everything that dared to stand against the sky. But down here, there was only stillness. The thick walls of stone and packed earth swallowed the howl of the wind until it was nothing but a distant murmur, far away, soft, harmless. The cold could not follow her down the stairs. The little iron stove glowed in its corner, throwing its steady warmth across the chamber, and the air was good, clean and fresh, drawn down through the pipes he had placed with such care, so that even buried in the earth beneath a screaming storm, she could breathe. She stood there, dripping, shaking, her chest heaving, and she began quietly to weep, not from fear. The fear was behind her now, from the unbearable truth of it. It worked. It worked exactly as he had promised it would, exactly as he had drawn it, season after lonely season, while the whole town called him a dreamer and a fool. The earth held the warmth. The stone held back the cold. The deep, patient stillness held back the screaming world above. He had been right. He had been right all along, and he was not there to see it. She sank down onto the floor with her back against the warm stone, and the dog came and pressed himself the length of her side, and she put her arms around him and held on, and let it all come. The grief, and the relief, and the terrible, aching gratitude, all of it at once, down there in the gold light, deep beneath the storm. Time lost its meaning in the chamber. There was no day below the earth, no night, only the small, steady glow of the stove, and the soft hiss of the lantern, and the muffled, far-off voice of the storm that never entirely stopped. She fell into a rhythm because rhythm was the only way to mark the passing of hours that had no light to measure them by. She tended the fire. She fed it carefully, the way she had learned, keeping it breathing low and even, never wasteful, never letting it burn too fast. She measured out the food and the water and the precious oil, making each thing stretch the way his notes had taught her. She read his plans again, slowly in the quiet, not because she needed them anymore, but because his hand was on the paper, and tracing his lines was a way of holding his hand across the distance the grave had put between them. And she talked to the dog. In a low voice, in the warm dark, she told him things about the man who had built this place with his own 2 hands, about the summer nights, the moonlight, the dirt running through his fingers, about the future the 2 of them had once imagined together. The very future she was sitting inside of now, alone. The dog listened the way only a dog can, without judgment, without restlessness, without ever, even once, getting up to leave. And the hours passed, above and below, marked only by the slow burning of the candle and the steady rhythm of the fire, until she had lost all sense of how long the storm had raged. It was on what she would later understand to be the fourth day that the silence broke. She was feeding the fire when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the storm, some new violence of the wind, a shutter torn loose far above, a beam giving way, the old shed surrendering at last to the weight of the snow. But it came again, and it was not the storm. It was a sound the storm could not make. A fist pounding. Bang, bang, bang. On the shed door, up at the top of the stairs. The dog was on his feet in an instant, hackles rising along his spine, a low warning starting in his throat. She froze where she knelt, her heart suddenly slamming against her ribs, listening, certain she had imagined it, willing it to have been the wind. It came again, weaker now, desperate. Bang, bang. And then, a voice, faint, torn, ragged by the wind, barely reaching her through the earth and the stone, but unmistakably a voice. Please. She rose slowly to her feet. She knew that voice, even broken, even half swallowed by the storm. She knew it. Garrett. She stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, one hand pressed flat to her chest, and she did not move. Because everything came back to her then, all at once, in a single cold flood, his gentle voice that never once reached his eyes. A woman alone. You'll bury yourself before the winter ever gets the chance. The whispers in the warm, crowded store. The eyes that slid toward her and away. The pity, which was worse than cruelty. The certainty, his and the whole town's, that she was a problem to be solved, a burden to be moved along. A foolish girl who would surely break before spring. And then the colder memories. The brace knocked loose in the dark that she had been so sure she'd set firm. The supplies spilled and ruined in the snow. The tracks leading away toward the road in the gray dawn light. The man who had wanted her to fail so badly that he had crept onto her land in the dark to make certain of it. That man was pounding on her door now. That man was begging, and some hard, cold part of her, some part that had every right in the world to its hardness, whispered that she could simply stand here, in the warmth, in the safety she had built with her own bleeding hands, the very safety he had tried to take from her. She could let the storm have him. No one would ever know. The thought was there, and it was real, and she did not pretend to herself that it wasn't. She climbed the stairs slowly. Each one creaked beneath her weight. The dog followed close at her heels, silent now, watching her. The pounding had nearly stopped. It was a frail thing now, the last of a man's strength, spent against a closed and silent door. And as she reached the top, as she put her cold hand on the iron latch of the hatch, another sound reached her. Thin, high, fragile, a child, crying, and every cold and rightful thought in her went still. She stood there, her hand on the latch, the child's cry threading down to her through the storm and the stone, and the hardness in her had suddenly nowhere left to stand. Whatever Garrett had done, whatever he was, whatever he deserved. There was a child out there in the white, a child who had done nothing to anyone, a child who would freeze in his father's failing arms while a grown woman stood warm and safe below and chose to let him. She had built this place from a dead man's dream and her own refusal to break. She had built it because of a single word written slow and deep at the bottom of a page. Us. He had not built it to keep the cold out and the world away. He had built it to keep people alive. She lifted the latch. She climbed up into the shed and crossed to the door and threw it open, and the storm exploded inward. Wind and snow howled into the shed, and out of the roaring white came a shape, a man, bent nearly double, staggering, ice frozen into his beard, his coat stiff as board, and clutched against his chest, wrapped and shielded by both his arms, a small bundle that moved. Garrett. He stumbled past her into the shelter of the shed, gasping, barely able to keep his feet, and behind him came another figure, a woman wrapped in blankets gone hard and white with ice, her face the gray of ash, her steps faltering and slow. Cecily. She reached the doorway and her legs gave beneath her, and she began to fall, and the woman lunged and caught her and dragged her in out of the killing wind. The roof, Garrett gasped. His voice cracked, more than half gone. It came down, the whole house. We had nowhere. He could not finish it. He stood there in the swirling white, holding his son against his chest, and he looked at the woman he had tried to break. And there was nothing left in his face at all but terror and exhaustion and a desperate, wordless plea. She did not waste a single breath on him. Down, she said. All of you. Now. Move. She took the child from his arms. The little boy was rigid with cold. His small face was white as paper, his lips going blue at the edges. And when she held him against her, she felt the dangerous stillness in his small body. The slowness that comes before the cold takes a person for good. She did not hesitate. She turned and carried him down into the earth. The others came behind her, the man and the woman, half falling down the creaking stairs, out of the storm and into the warmth, into the gold light, into the deep, safe stillness beneath the world. And at the bottom, they stopped. All three of them stopped and stared. Cecily's eyes moved slowly across the chamber, the fitted stone walls, the shelves carved into the living earth, the stove glowing warm in its corner, the food, the water, the careful order of a place built by a patient hand to keep human beings alive through the worst the world could do. And the blood began, slowly, to come back into her gray face. Her cracked lips parted, and she made a small broken sound that was almost a sob of disbelief. But it was Garrett's face that changed the most. The woman watched it happen, even as she worked over the child. She watched the disbelief come first, that this could be here, beneath the worthless shed, beneath the land he had tried to buy for next to nothing. The land he had called not worth the nails that held it together. Then came the understanding. And then, piece by piece, the thing she never thought she would live to see fall from the face of that gentle, certain man, his pride. It went out of him like air from a wound. Everything he had believed about his fool of a brother, about the foolish, grieving girl, about who was strong and who was weak in this world, who would survive and who would break. All of it crumbled right there in the warm gold light as he understood at last what she had built and what it meant, and whose mercy he and his family were now standing inside of. He could not speak. He only stood there, swaying on his feet, and looked at the walls his brother had raised in secret. And his eyes filled, and he turned his face away into the shadows so that no one would see. And only the silence remained. She did not let any of it slow her hands. There was a child going cold by the stove, and that mattered more than every wound and every reckoning in the world. She laid the little boy down close to the warmth, and she stripped the frozen wrappings from his small body, and she bundled him in the warm, dry blanket she had carried down through the storm at such cost. She took his small, cold hands and chafed them between her own rough ones, and she spoke to him the whole time, low and steady, an unbroken stream of warmth. There now, little one. You're safe. You're warm. The cold can't reach you here. Open your eyes for me. There's a brave boy. There you are. And slowly, the color came back into him. The blue left his lips. His small chest began to rise and fall more deeply, more easily. His eyes fluttered and opened and found her face above him in the gold light, and held there a moment, frightened and uncertain. And then, at last, unafraid. His name was Toby. He was small enough that the world was still mostly made of what the grown-ups told him it was. And the grown-ups had told him, in the careless way grown-ups do without ever quite meaning to, that the woman at the edge of the valley was someone to be wary of. Strange. To be pitied, perhaps, and perhaps a little feared. The widow who dug in the dirt, like something gone wrong in the head. But the widow who dug in the dirt was the one holding him now. She was the warm hands and the steady voice and the safe place beneath the screaming world. And a child knows what a child feels, no matter what he has been told to think. The storm did not end with their coming. More days passed, down there in the warmth, while it spent its fury on the world above. And in those days, something grew between the woman and the boy that none of them had expected. He followed her. Wherever she moved in the small chamber, he went, the way the dog did, 2 small steps behind. He watched her tend the fire, and after a while she let him help. She showed him how to feed the flame, how to read its color, how to keep it breathing low and steady through the long dark. It has to breathe, she told him, crouched beside him at the open door of the stove. Same as you and me. Too little air, and it dies. Too much, and it burns itself out too fast. You have to find the middle of it. You have to pay attention. That's the whole secret of it. Just paying attention. He listened with his whole serious small self, nodding, taking it in. She unrolled the plans for him one evening and held the lantern close and let him look at all of it. A man drew every line of this, she said softly, long before the storm came, before anyone in the whole valley believed there would ever be a storm at all. And do you know what they did when they saw him out here working? They laughed at him. They called him a foolish dreamer. The boy studied the careful drawings, the measurements, the diagrams of the very stone room they were all sitting safe and warm inside of. Was he foolish? The boy asked, and the woman was quiet for a long moment. No, she said at last. No, he wasn't foolish at all. He just saw something the rest of them couldn't see. And here's the part that matters, Toby. He didn't stop believing in it. Not even when everyone he knew laughed at him for it. Not even when it would have been so much easier to give up and be like everybody else. She touched the careful lines with one rough fingertip. That's not foolishness, little one. That's the bravest thing there is. The boy was quiet, taking that in the way children take in the things that stay with them for the rest of their lives. Did you know him? He asked. I did, she said softly. I loved him. And the boy who had been taught to be wary of her, who had been told she was strange and sad and to be pitied, looked up at her in the gold light now with something else entirely in his eyes, something like wonder. He did not see a widow to be pitied. He saw the woman who had built the safe place, the woman who had pulled him out of the cold and the dark, the woman who knew how to keep a fire breathing and how to read the secret drawings, and who had loved a brave man that nobody else in the whole world had believed in. He saw a hero, and Garrett saw it too. He sat in the corner of the chamber, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, and he watched his son trail after the woman he had so deeply wronged. He watched the boy look up at her with that open, shining wonder, a way the boy had never once looked at him. And something broke in him then that had needed breaking for a very long time. It came on the second day they were below. Cecily and the boy were sleeping, warm and safe and whole by the stove. The dog lay watching the foot of the stairs, and Garrett rose in the quiet and crossed the chamber to where the woman sat alone by the lantern. He stood before her a long time, unable to find the beginning of it. When the words finally came, they came rough and low and stripped at last of every gentle thing he had ever hidden himself behind. It was me, he said. She looked up at him and said nothing. The braces you found knocked loose, the supplies ruined in the snow, the tracks leading off toward the road. His jaw worked. He could barely hold her eyes. It was me. I came in the dark, before the light, and I told myself it was for your own good, that if I made it hard enough, you'd give up, you'd sell, you'd go somewhere safe and warm and far away, and you'd thank me for it someday. He stopped. He drew a ragged breath. That's a lie. I told myself a great many lies out here in the dark. The truth is plainer than that. I wanted the land. I have debts, the kind that don't let a man sleep. And I couldn't stand... His voice failed him entirely. He forced it on. I couldn't stand watching you do the thing he believed in, when I never in my life believed in anything but myself. The chamber was very quiet. Above them, far away, the storm murmured on. He was my brother, Garrett said, and his voice broke completely now, and he made no effort to hide it. And I laughed at him. Every single day of his life, I laughed at him, and I called him a fool, and I thought I was the wise one. And he looked around at the stone walls, at the glowing stove, at his sleeping wife, and his sleeping son. He built the thing that's keeping my boy alive. He could not go on. He stood there, a broken man in a borrowed blanket, deep in the earth his brother had hollowed out by hand, holding nothing in the world but the truth. And the woman looked at him for a long time. She had every right to her hardness. She had earned it in blood and cold, and the long, lonely labor of the dark, and the sabotage of his own hands. But she turned and looked at the sleeping child by the fire, the child Garrett had carried through the killing storm, the child who had gone nearly cold and still in her own arms not 2 days before, and who breathed easy now in the warmth she had built. And she found that the hardness had nowhere left in her to live. "He would have opened the door for you," she said at last, quietly. "He wouldn't have hesitated for a single second. Not for your sake, maybe." She nodded toward the sleeping boy. "But for that one, he'd have run out into the storm to carry him in himself." Garrett's shoulders shook. "So sit down," she said, gently now. "Get warm. We'll speak of the rest of it when the storm is done, and the sun is up, and we can see what's left of the world. There's time enough for all of it then." And that was all. No speeches, no reckoning forced upon him, no making the broken man crawl across the floor for the comfort of her forgiveness. Just a door opened, the same way she had opened the one above, and Garrett sat down heavily in the warmth his brother had built, and he put his face in his rough hands, and his shoulders shook in the gold light, and the woman let him be. On what she would come to understand was the 7th morning. The storm ended. She felt it before she heard it. The far-off murmur that had been their one constant companion, the low and ceaseless voice of the ruined world above, simply stopped, and in its place came a silence so complete, so total, and so deep, that it woke her from a thin and dreamless sleep. She lay still in the warm dark, listening. Nothing. No wind. No howl. No driving snow against the earth far above her head. Only the soft crackle of the stove, and the slow, even breathing of the sleeping family, and the dog lifting his head from his paws, ears pricked, listening too. She rose quietly, so as not to wake them. She climbed the creaking stairs alone, the dog padding faithfully up behind her, and she put both hands flat against the underside of the hatch, and she pushed. It would not move at first. A great weight of snow lay piled upon it. She set her shoulder beneath the wood and pushed harder, and slowly, with a soft hiss and cascade of sliding snow, it gave and lifted and fell open, and light poured down. She climbed up into the shed, blinking, and crossed to the door, and pushed it open against the drift that had piled against it in the night. And she stepped out into a world made new. The sun had returned. It hung low and brilliant in a sky scrubbed clean and pale, painfully bright after so many days of dark, and it fell across a valley she did not recognize. The land had vanished beneath the snow, not covered, buried, swallowed whole. Great drifts rose like white dunes where the fences had stood. The familiar shapes of the world were gone, softened and rounded and erased, made strange and silent and beautiful and terrible all at once. Off across the field, the cabin was a low white mound, its roof caved in beneath the crushing weight, its broken walls just visible at the edges of the snow. If she had stayed in it, if she had not listened to a dead man's dream and gone down into the earth. She did not let herself finish the thought. She stood in the blinding, bitter, cold light, and the dog stood close beside her, and behind her, one by one, the others came up out of the warm dark into the morning. Cecily first, her arm around her son. Then the boy, Toby, who looked out at the buried valley with huge round eyes, and then up at the woman who had saved him, as if to be certain she was still there. And Garrett came last of all. He stood beside her in the doorway of the shed, and he looked out at the buried valley, at the place where his own house had stood, now nothing but a far white scar upon the endless snow. Neither of them spoke for a long, long time. The whole valley lay silent before them, transformed, terrible and beautiful both, swept utterly clean by a fury that had at last spent itself and gone. And every living soul who had come through that long, dark week alive had come through it because a man no one believed in had once knelt in the summer moonlight and let the dirt run slow through his fingers and said a thing the whole world had laughed at him for saying. The safest place isn't above the ground. It's under it. Garrett turned slowly and looked back at the dark, open mouth of the hatch behind them, at the stone and the timber and the deep and patient strength his brother had raised alone, in secret, against the laughter of everyone he knew. And then he turned and looked at the woman standing beside him in the brilliant cold, and the words came quietly. No excuses left in them now, no conditions, no gentle mask, just the truth, plain and bare, from a man who had finally learned the full weight of it. "Thank you," he said, "for all of us, for my boy. Thank you." And out across the buried, shining, silent valley, the first thin trails of smoke had begun, here and there, to rise into the pale morning sky. As the people of the small town, those who had lived, began slowly and with wonder to dig themselves free. The valley dug itself free slowly. It took days. The snow lay so deep and so still and so heavy that the people had to carve their way out of their own homes one shovel length at a time, tunneling toward their barns, their wood piles, the dim shapes of their neighbors' houses across the white. The land had been remade. The familiar world was gone, and a stranger one had taken its place, softer, rounder, terrible in its silence. Fences had vanished. Roads had vanished. Whole fields lay under drifts taller than a man, and in the quiet after, as the thin smoke began to rise from the chimneys of those who had come through, word began to travel from house to house, the way word always does in a small place. The widow at the edge of the valley had lived. Not only lived, she had taken in the very family that had tried to drive her from her land, and she had kept them and herself alive through the whole long dark. At first, no one quite believed it. The widow they had pitied, the foolish girl who dug in the frozen dirt, the one they had all so quietly, so certainly agreed would not see the spring. She had seen it, and when the roads were clear enough to travel at last, they began to come. A few at first, a neighbor, then another, picking their way across the white field to the homestead at the edge of the world, to see with their own eyes the thing they had only heard whispered across their fences. She let them come. She did not gloat. She did not turn them away with the same coldness they had once turned on her. There was no triumph in her, and no spite. There had been too much cold, and too much loss for any of that to feel like anything but more cold. She simply led them, a few at a time, out across the field to the old leaning shed, and down the creaking stairs, into the earth, and there, in the gold light of the lantern, the people of the valley fell silent. They stood among the fitted stone walls, the shelves carved into the living earth, the warm iron stove in its corner. And they understood, all at once, and far too late, the size of the thing they had laughed at. The whispers stopped. The pity stopped. A man who had called her husband a dreamer to his very face stood now with his hat crushed in his hands, turning it over and over, unable to lift his eyes from the floor. A woman who had looked away from her in the warm, crowded store reached out, hesitant, almost reverent, and laid her fingers against the careful stonework, and then turned and found the widow's eyes and held them. And in her face was something that had never once been there before. Not pity, not the careful, distant kindness people offered to the doomed. Respect. The widow they had been so certain would break had outlasted the very worst the world could throw at her. Not because she was lucky, not because some chance had spared her, because she had listened when every other soul in the valley had refused to. Because when a dreaming man knelt in the dirt and said a strange thing, she had not laughed. And when he was gone, and she had every reason in the world to give up, she had picked up his unfinished dream and carried it the rest of the way alone. They saw all of it, standing there in the gold light beneath the field, and not one of them ever laughed at her again. Spring came late that year, but it came. It always does. That is the quiet mercy of the world, that no winter, however long, however cruel, has ever once managed to be the last. The great drifts softened, then sank, then gave way at last to the steady music of running water. The white retreated up the hills in patches, then in sheets, then all together. The buried fences emerged, broken in places, leaning but standing. And beneath the melting snow, where everyone had been so sure the land lay dead, the green came pushing up, pale at first, tentative, then bolder. Grass through the wet black earth, buds swelling on the bare gray trees, and the small returning sounds of the birds that had fled the storm, and now, one by one, found their way home. The valley woke, and the woman woke with it. She had not understood, through the long dark, how much of herself the grief had buried, how small she had grown inside it, how quiet, how far down into herself she had been forced to go, simply to survive. But the spring reached her the way it reached the frozen ground, slowly, gently, without asking, and slowly, without quite deciding to, she began to come back up toward the light. The cabin had to be rebuilt. The roof had caved beneath the crushing weight of the snow, and the walls had cracked and leaned, and it could not be lived in as it was. And this time, she did not do it alone. They came without being asked. The neighbors, the men who had once whispered behind her back, and the women who had once looked away in the store. They came with their tools and their wagons and their strong backs, and they tore down what could not be saved. And they raised the cabin walls back up, true and square. They set new beams across the roof. They worked from the early light until the gold of evening, and they did not leave until it was done. She stood watching them one bright cold morning, the dog at her side, and she did not fully know what to do with the feeling that rose in her chest. She had been so alone, for so long, and now her yard was full of people who had come, of their own free will, to help her. It was not that they had suddenly all become kind. People do not change so quickly, or so simply as that. The world is not a fairy story. It was that they had seen her, at last, truly seen her, And a person who has been truly seen is never again quite so alone in the world. Garrett changed the most of all of them. It did not happen overnight. The breaking of a man's pride is one thing. The slow, hard rebuilding of his life into something better, that is another thing altogether. And it does not come easy, and it does not come fast. But he set himself to it. He paid back what he owed in time, the hard and honest way, without complaint. And then he did a thing that no one in the valley had ever expected of him. He began to build, not for himself, not for his name, not for any gain that anyone could see. There were others in the valley like her. He had never truly noticed them before. But now somehow he could not stop noticing them. The widows, the old ones, living alone at the ends of long roads. The ones with no strong back to raise a wall or dig a deep place against the next hard winter. The ones the valley, in its quiet and careless way, had long ago decided did not quite matter enough to think about. Garrett went to them, one by one. He brought his tools, and his 2 strong hands, and the careful plans his brother had drawn in a steady, patient hand, and he helped them dig. He helped them set the stone. He showed them how to place the pipes that carried the clean air down into the dark. He stayed until the work was finished and the cold was shut out for good. And he asked for nothing in return. Not a coin, not a word of thanks. When people asked him why a man who had once cared for nothing in this world but his own name now spent his days breaking his back in the dirt for folks who could never hope to repay him, he never had much of an answer ready. My brother saw something the rest of us couldn't, was all he would say, leaning a moment on his shovel. Took me near to losing everything I had to finally see it for myself. And then he would go back to digging. The man who had once crept onto her land in the gray dark to make her fail, spent the rest of his years helping the overlooked people of the valley build places where the cold could never reach them again. That was his redemption, not words. Not one grand and tearful moment of forgiveness given and received. Just the long, quiet, daily work of slowly becoming someone his brother would have been proud, at last, to call his own. And the boy, Toby, the boy did not go back to being wary of her. Whatever had passed between them in the warm dark, deep beneath the earth, with the storm screaming far above their heads, it had become a part of him now, woven into him, the way the deepest things of childhood always are. He came back, again and again, all through that spring and the long warm summers that followed. The small figure would appear at the far edge of her field, and the dog would lift his gray head from his paws, and his tail would begin to sweep slow across the boards, and the boy would come running across the green. She taught him things, how to read the weather the way the old folks did, not from a paper or a chart, but from the behavior of the birds, the slant of the evening light, the particular feeling that comes into the deep, cold air before something is about to change. How to set a stone so that it would hold the weight of years. How to keep a fire breathing, low and steady, through the longest night. And how to look at a thing the whole world called foolish, and ask himself quietly whether they had ever truly looked at it at all, or whether they had only laughed because laughing was the easier thing to do. She told him about Elias, She told him all the stories, the summer nights thick and warm, the full moon hung low and yellow over the hills, the dirt running slow through a dreaming man's fingers, the quiet, certain smile of a man who knew something the rest of them did not, and who never stopped believing it, no matter how they laughed. And the boy carried those stories the way children carry the things that shape them forever, so that the dreamer no one had believed in did not vanish from the world the day they lowered him into the cold hill. He lived on, in the warmth of the stone room beneath the field, in the lives of every soul who had survived the long dark within its walls, and in the serious, watching eyes of a boy who would grow up believing, down to the marrow of his bones, that the bravest thing a person could ever do was to keep faith with something true, even alone, even in the dark, even when the whole wide world was laughing. The years went on, the way the years do. The valley changed slowly, in ways that no one quite remarked upon while they were happening. It became an ordinary thing, in time, to dig deep before the winter, to set the stone and carve the shelves and place the slender pipes that drew the clean air down into the earth. The thing one man had been mocked and pitied for. The whole valley came in the end to do without a moment's second thought, as though it were the most natural and obvious wisdom in the world. But the woman herself never once thought of it as a monument. She did not need the valley to remember Elias in stone and timber and the careful geometry of buried rooms. She remembered him in a warmer way than that. She remembered him every time the boy came running across her field, every time a neighbor she had once thought a stranger stopped at her gate to ask after her and truly meant it, every time the spring came pushing up green and stubborn through the cold black earth, the way she herself had once come pushing back up toward the light when she had been so certain there was no light left to reach. The grief never left her entirely. She did not expect it to. She did not even wish it to. A love like that does not leave a person clean and untouched. It leaves a mark, and the mark is the price of having loved so deeply in the first place. And she would not have traded it away, not for anything, not even if she somehow could. But the grief learned in time to live alongside something gentler, a quiet, a peace. The peace of a woman who had stood once on a cold hill in the wind, with a dog pressed against her leg and the whole town watching her fail, and had been certain, down to her bones, that she had nothing left in the world, no one, no place, no reason to go on, and who had been wrong about every part of it. There was an evening, many years on, that seemed to hold all of it in a single, still and golden moment. The light was going long and warm across the field, the very same kind of light that had lain across the grass on that summer night so long ago, when a man had crouched in the dirt and told her, with a smile, where the safe places in this world truly were. She sat on the porch of the rebuilt cabin. An old dog lay asleep at her feet, gray now all through his muzzle, his breathing slow and easy and content in the warm, still air. Out at the far edge of the field, the old shed still stood. She had never torn it down. She never would. It leaned a little more with each passing year, the way old and faithful things do, but it stood, and beneath it, deep in the patient earth, the stone room waited still, exactly as he had built it, exactly as she had finished it with her own two bleeding hands. A figure was crossing the field toward her through the gold light, taller now than he had been, long of leg, broad in the shoulder, half a man already, but unmistakable. The boy, not so small anymore. He raised a hand to her as he came, and the old dog lifted his head and thumped his tail against the worn boards of the porch, and the woman raised her own hand in answer. And something settled deep in her chest, soft and full and complete. She thought, as she sometimes did at this hour, of the young widow she had been, alone in the freezing wind, so certain the whole of her future had been lowered into the ground with the man she loved. She would have wanted to tell that woman something if she only could have reached back across all those years to do it. She would have wanted to say that the wind would not have the last word, that the door she was so afraid to open held not an ending, but a beginning, that the man she was burying on that cold hill had not, after all, left her with nothing. He had left her the truest thing one soul can leave another, a reason to keep going, a reason to dig down past the bottom of her own grief and find there, in the cold and the dark, a strength she had never once known she carried, and that the very people who had stood watching her fail, certain and unkind, would one day cross that same long field to sit beside her in the gold of evening and call her friend. The boy reached the porch. He sat down on the step at her feet, the way he had once sat by the stove on that first long night beneath the earth, and the old dog shifted with a contented sigh to lay his gray head across the boy's knee. For a while, none of them spoke. The light moved slow and warm across the waking land, and the small sounds of the evening rose up gently all around them. "Do you still miss him?" the boy asked at last, quietly, the way a person asks a thing he has wondered about for a long, long time, and only now found the courage to say aloud. And the woman was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the old leaning shed, and the long gold field, and the green hills standing soft against the failing sky. "Every day," she said softly, "but not the way I used to." She rested her hand on the old dog's warm gray head. "At first, missing him was the only thing I had left of him, so I held on to it. I held on so tight my hands hurt with it." She breathed out, slow and even. "And then, little by little, I learned that he left me far more than something to miss. He left me a way to live. He left me a whole valley full of people in the end. He left me you, in a manner of speaking. He left me all of this." She turned and looked down at the boy who was so nearly a man now. "Missing someone," she said. "That's just love, child. Love with nowhere left to go, for a little while." She looked back out at the gold field. "But love always finds new places to go again, if you let it. That's the part nobody warns you about, in the worst of it. It feels like the end of everything. And it isn't. Love always, always finds somewhere new to go." The boy thought about that in his quiet and serious way. And then he leaned his head against her knee, the way he had as a small, frightened child in the warm dark, and the three of them, the woman, the boy, and the old gray dog, sat together in the last of the gold light, while the valley settled gently into evening all around them. She had been the widow they pitied, the woman they were all so certain would break. She had stood alone in the wind on the coldest day of her whole life, and the entire world had quietly decided she was finished. And here she was, not finished, not alone, at peace in the warm gold evening, in a life she had dug for herself out of the frozen ground with nothing but her own 2 hands and a dead man's faith. A life now full to the brim with the very people who had once turned their faces away. Out at the edge of the field, the old shed leaned into the gentle light, and beneath it, deep in the patient earth, the room that had saved them all rested quietly in the dark. No longer a secret, no longer a thing to be laughed at, a quiet, enduring proof that the ones the world overlooks are so often the very ones who see the furthest, that a dream kept faith with, even alone, even in the deepest dark, can outlast the one who first dared to dream it, and that no winter, however long, however cruel, ever lasts forever. The light faded soft and slow over the hills. The woman closed her eyes, and she felt the warmth of the boy against her knee, and the slow, easy breathing of the old dog, and the deep and settled peace of the life she had built up out of the ruins of her grief. And somewhere in that quiet, she could almost feel him there, not gone, never truly gone, just beneath it all, holding everything gently up, the way the deep, patient earth holds up the whole turning world.